My guest today is Mike Hacker. Mike is the director of the Microsoft practice in Michigan for Sogeti. Mike, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
You work in a lot of heterogeneous customer environments, customers that have a lot of different applications, a lot of different platforms, a lot of different security models, right?
Yep, very much so.
And you get a lot of requests for single sign-on.
Correct, yeah.
What is that?
Single sign-on is the idea of being able to log into one environment and then seamlessly move into other applications without having to log back in. So a lot of people get really upset about all these different login prompts that they get. So first they log into their computer, and then they go to another web app, and then they got to log into that one, and then they go someplace else, and then they got to log into that one. So a lot of people, end users in particular, complain about that, and they say that they want a seamless experience. So they don't have to remember all these passwords. They don't want to have to remember all of the security rules within the organization that they have to change. This one every 90 days, this one every 60 days, and end up with all these mixed different passwords and usernames and things like that. They want just one single login, such as their desktop login,
Okay.
and then that gets them into everything.
So the idea of a single sign-on is every application has its own security model, has its own set of credentials, has its own rules for maintaining those credentials, and every application requires you to log in, but a single sign-on says, we'll handle that for you, or the single sign-on process will handle that for you. Log in one time and somewhere magically behind the scenes.
Correct.
That'll just, you will be logged into these applications, because the applications have a reason for a login.
Absolutely.
When they're designed, they want somebody to log in. So we're sort of skirting that, aren't we?
Yeah, and that can actually pose a lot of technical challenges because all these applications are written differently. So, one web-based application might just have a form. Another one is, if you're using Windows-based authentication, you might get the little Windows basic authentication prompt.
Right.
Others are, token-based. There's so many different ways that people can actually log into a system and the way that it's processed. Some applications actually do provide means, such as APIs, to allow you to do single sign-on type of functionality. Some of them don't. And so these products that allow you to do single sign-on usually kind of simulate the user's keystrokes or the user's actions to kind of accomplish the same thing. So
kind of like a screen scrape.
Yes, yeah, sort of like that. Some of them are like that. In the web world, a lot of it is doing it through like forms posts.
Okay.
So you have a form with a username and a password box. Well, those have certain names, and when they get posted back, the web server interprets that as the information that's being passed in. So if you can have some other system or process do that same step, that can log you in.
Just programmatically post to that form.
Programmatically post that form. But then there's a lot of challenges around that because you have to do that and get a cookie back to hold on to the cookie, which will be your login kind of token per se.
Yep.
And you run into lots of different scenarios where you can't just pass that in. So, for example, if I want to have a single sign-on into a web-based application, if I don't already have the cookie to allow me to just kind of pass through, I have to generate that cookie somehow. So that means I have to physically connect to the site, pass in the username and password correctly, get the cookie back that gets set on my system, and then it allows me in. Well, if I write an application that does this, the application actually has the context of that cookie and gets it back. And now if I try to get the person redirected to that area, they don't have access to that information. So single sign-on is very, very difficult at times, can be very confusing, very complicated. Some of the technologies that are out there do it fairly well. There's Microsoft has their own. There's many other companies that do them. One that comes to mind is Integrity. They do a lot of web-based single sign-on, and they also it's based around cookies for tracking.
So this single sign-on that only works for web pages?
This one is, yes. Okay. This one in particular, Integrity, as far as I'm aware of. I don't believe that it does for Windows-based applications. My personal background is more with web-based applications.
Because you're a Sharepoint guy.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where I'm kind of taking it.
Yeah.
But and bringing that up with SharePoint, SharePoint's a good example of a portal interface that people want to come to and automatically be logged into. Well, that happens already with Windows-based authentication. You're logged into your desktop. As long as you're part of the domain where your SharePoint environment is, you're logged right in, and up in the corner you're going to see your name up there.
And SharePoint just
knows
sits
who
on
you are.
top of the Windows authentication.
Exactly.
It takes advantage of that. It's
Absolutely.
all right in.
It could use other authentication stores, but in this time it uses just Windows-based authentication, so it works really well. Well, now a person's there, and you decide that you want to have links off to other applications. For example, maybe webmail, or maybe a time tracking system.
And those systems have their own security model, their own logins, their own authentication.
Absolutely. So now people go in there and they want the experience that they just had with SharePoint, is that know who I am, let me in. I don't want to have to do all this other work.
Sounds reasonable.
Well, there are multiple ways, once again, that this can be accomplished through a product like Integrity that can kind of have its own, kind of like a redirect page. So it's a link that you would have on your SharePoint, and when they click on that to go to the application, we're not sending them directly to the application. We're kind of detouring them through this other system that gets them this cookie that logs them into the system automatically. So that works out well. Then there's a lot of people hear about...
So just to clarify, SharePoint doesn't have that built into it out of the box.
Absolutely
It's
not.
something you have to build yourself or buy and integrate.
Correct. And some people get confused by that because they hear SharePoint single sign-on or Microsoft single sign-on, which is part of SharePoint, because they'll go into the central administration and they'll see this single sign-on.
And that's different. How does that differ?
This is different because this is really targeted more towards being used by the web parts within SharePoint. So, for example, you might have a line of business system in the back end and you want to surface some data through a web part onto the screen. So, with the Microsoft version of single sign-on, you can have a shared credential, which is used by this web part no matter who you are. This is what I'm going to log you into as in the back end. And that's one way. Or you can have individual credentials. And what SharePoint does is, or Microsoft Single Sign-On, has a secured database that just stores those usernames, credentials against a specific application name. So if you have this application definition. That works well. However, it doesn't give you the capability to just say, I've got a link here. When I click on it, automatically pass my credentials to this application.
Okay, so make sure I understand this correctly. The Microsoft built-in SharePoint single sign-on, once you're in the application, it stores what the credentials are to get to back-end data or things like that.
Correct.
Whereas where it falls short is it doesn't get you into that application in the first place.
Correct.
So if your application, if your web part is exposing a time and billing system, you'll still have to log in to that time and billing system, even if you're using a web part, even if you have single sign-on turned in.
Correct. So the web part. So the idea is so that the web part doesn't prompt you for authentication.
Okay.
So the web part would get you
where a
through.
third party would come from.
But if you wanted to get to the actual application behind the scenes, SharePoint's authentication store isn't going to get you there.
Okay.
Now, when I say it's not going to get you there, it's not going to get you there out of the box. And in fact, single sign-on is really not an out-of-the-box solution. There's just not very many consistent ways of doing authentication between applications that you can guarantee every single application is going to take these parameters for username and password and going to log you in.
Was that because there's too many different interfaces to signing on to that vision?
Yeah, and once again, we're only talking the web side of things. When you move into Windows-based applications, it even gets even crazier.
Sure.
So, going back to the SharePoint single sign-on data store, I mean, basically we're talking about nothing more than a database that's storing application name, username, and password in an encrypted format, and tying it back to a Windows authentication ID.
Okay.
Or some other ID, so we can say, okay, if you're this person and this is the application, then here's the username and password to use. Once again, I say to use because it doesn't automatically pass it in. So, an example of one client that I worked with, they wanted to be able to do this with, for example, the time tracker system. So they wanted to automatically have, when you click on the link, it automatically take you into time tracker. So we had to write actually some custom code to interface with the SharePoint and the single sign-on APIs to allow us to do this. We're using the single sign-on store as nothing more than just that, a storage mechanism. We had to write all the logic on number one, is this user in in this database system. So does this user already have a stored username and password? If not, what do? Well, we have to ask them for that, and then we have to store it in that store. And so that we do keep track of it. The next thing is that once we do have that username and password, what do we do with it? So the code had to know how to format then a response to this third-party application, this time tracker, to get you logged in. Another one was a media management system. That one also required single sign-on. That one was different because that one actually had an API for single sign-on. So what you had to do was actually make a call to the system, which would give you a token back, and then you put that token in the URL to redirect the person to that URL with this token in the query string, and it allowed you right on through. So slightly different. So as each one of these applications are slightly different in the way that they handle single sign-on, we have to write custom code to manage each one of those individual ones. So getting the username, or checking to see if a user has a username or password in this data store is the same. Retrieving the password out of the store and the username is the same. But where it gets different is where we have to customize what do we do once we get that information. How do we get it out to these other things?
Got it. So it sounds like that the best that a single sign-on solution can deliver for you out of the box is really just a framework.
It really is.
And then it's up to you, the developer, the implementer, to actually figure out, okay, there's my back-end system. I need to connect to that. What's the interface? Is
Absolutely.
it an API? Is it a cookie? Is it
whatever it happens
whatever
to
it
be.
happens to be? Then you've got some work to do yourself.
Absolutely. And one of the other things too, before companies even head down this whole path of single sign-on, they really need to step back and think about what they're really trying to accomplish, because a lot of times you'll hear complaints from a user about having to sign into all these systems. Well, to them it might make sense. Okay, I shouldn't have to log into this one if I've already logged into my computer, and I shouldn't have to log into that one. But when you really start drilling down into it, some organizations end up spending a lot of money on a single sign-on solution and then find out it really doesn't solve the problem that was really there. And in fact, it can cause more. And I've seen this happen with some clients where they decided that we have to have a single sign-on solution. Our employees demand it. We have to have this. So they start investing time and money into it. And they realize that out of all their applications, there's only actually maybe a small, not even a handful of applications that they really can do single sign-on for, because the rest of them are too risky.
What do you mean by risky?
For example, you probably don't want single sign-on into your HR system, where someone can get their payroll information, where someone can get their pay stubs, things along that line. It can be very dangerous. So one of the things that once we started talking to these clients is like, well, do you understand what you're really asking for? Do you really want someone to log into their computer once and then be able to click on a link and get into their payroll information? At first they'll say yes, because that makes it easy. But then we say, do you realize that if your employee walks away from their desktop for 5 minutes or less, somebody else could walk right up to that desktop and get into their information, into their personal information? So this goes back into policies and procedures for the organization. Do they have screensavers that time out and force you to log in,
Sure.
after the screensaver comes up? And if so, what's the time frame on that? Do we do it at 1 minute and drive them absolutely crazy? Do we do it at 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? What's that acceptable risk factor? And then also training. So if you're going to do single sign-on, especially that risky applications, there's got to be a very in-depth training with your employees so that they understand what the risk is of them, first of all, walking away from their computer, but also sharing it. So if somebody walks up to their computer and says, hey, can I borrow your computer for 10 minutes? I need to print something.
Yep.
Well, then you probably want to be standing there and watching what they're doing.
Sure, and this is an issue you have even if you're just you take your laptop not connected to any network at all. If you walk away, leave it unattended and unlocked, I have access to all the documents on that laptop.
Absolutely.
And if you implement a single sign-on, I basically widen the area that I now have access to when I'm logged in as you. And
Absolutely.
therefore, I widen that risk.
Absolutely. Think about a vice president or a CIO or CTO or CEO of a company that's using single sign-on. Probably not a smart idea, because then he's going to go in there, and next thing you know, somebody walks into his office. It could be his assistant, for all that matters, and suddenly that person has access to a lot more information than the person really should have access to.
So you have guidelines that you give people as to decide what should be included in single sign-on, what should not?
It really varies from company to company because of those specific policies. So it's really up to their policies, and also sometimes government regulations. So are they in a area where certain information cannot be exposed to other people, and are they in systems? If they are, then you definitely don't want single sign-on into those systems where there's really sensitive data.
Right.
But it really is. It's all about what level of risk is the company willing to go with.
Sure.
What are they willing to accept? So if they're willing to accept, the risk of someone getting into your email, and you're going to do single sign-on into email, okay, well that might not be a big deal for most people. Some people might have a problem with that. One of the things that I'm actually doing currently with a client who has implemented single sign-on, we're actually, and they actually put this in place before I got involved. So we didn't have a chance to talk about all these additional risk factors and things like that. Now they're starting to realize that, and we're having more and more conversations about it. And we're going back and reevaluating how they're doing single sign-on and how we're going to do it in the future.
Yeah.
And so a couple thoughts that we did was, let's put the power of single sign-on in the hands of the user. Once again, this is more customization. In particular, I'm talking about a Sharepoint deployment here. We originally had a web part on the screen that was nothing more than a bunch of links to applications, and you clicked on them. Those were single sign-on links. You got into them.
Right.
These were the same links for everybody in every organization or every part of the organization. So it didn't matter which department you were in. It didn't matter what level you were in the organization. You had the same level of single sign-on links. Well, after looking at that, I kind of gave them a better idea. I said, let's make this customizable by user or by a group, some sort of audience. Okay. SharePoint has this concept of audiences. Let's use it. So let's put people in different audiences, and then let's use the audiences to target who sees what links. So now we have a little bit more control over who sees what. Not a big concept. SharePoint already does this. Where we took it one step further was, let's also give them the ability to decide also what links show up over there as the end user, and also allow the end user to decide whether they're single sign-on or not. So we gave them the ability to go through this web part, click an edit link, it takes them to a new page, and they can now go through and select which applications they want on their little shortcuts list, you could say, and which one of those are single sign-on enabled or not. And before they can save their changes, they actually have to enter in their Windows password again.
Right.
That way someone else that just happened to come to their box and it was unlocked, they can't go in there and suddenly say, well, this is single sign-on, and then be able to get right on through. So we did that. We also did a few things around more personalization. So targeting of groups of links and saying that these links are required on the screen and these aren't. And also even going so far as to saying which audiences can't change this list. And this came into a requirement because there was a group within this organization that their management said, we are going to define what applications show up. We do not want any of them to be single sign-on because some of these some of the computers in this group are shared.
Sure, maybe a shop floor type of environment.
Exactly, and we don't want them to be able to change this. So we set it up just like that. So the manager can tell us which ones they have. We set up an audience, we put the links in there, we set them to not be single sign-on, and we don't give anybody in that group the ability to make edits to those lists. And so that worked out really well, and in fact it's currently in going through the QA testing process right now, and hopefully it'll be released in a few weeks.
Oh, yeah. This goes right back to what you brought up before about education.
Absolutely.
So you've got to let your end users know single sign-on is great, but there's a risk factor involved. So in order for them to make an intelligent decision about which links they're going to enable for single sign-on, which ones they're not, they have to know what that means. What are the risks that they're exposing themselves to, and balance that against the convenience.
Absolutely, and so right now, the policy that we're looking at implementing is that all links by default that we're putting out there are not single sign-on enabled.
Oh, so they got to turn it on.
They have to turn it on, and they have to make that mental connection of what they're doing. There's a message at the top of the screen that tells them exactly what it means to do single sign-on, what the risks are. And they have to enter, like I said, they have to enter in their password. And it already knows who they are through their username, but we revalidate their password before they can make any of those changes. So. Okay.
Sounds like a lot of your job as a consultant is then just to educate these businesses in general, from the top down, finding out, they come to you and say, I want single sign-on. And you talk to them, is that really what you want? Do you really want 100% single sign-on?
Yeah.
So it's not all about technology, it's about talking through the business process, finding what they need.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's probably the downfall of some organizations where they go for someone to assist them with their technology deployment with somebody that only knows technology. They
Sure.
also need to understand what the business needs and risks are and consult with them. You don't want somebody that's heads down programmer that's going to go in there
Absolutely.
and say, I want single sign-on, so they go and they create this single sign-on thing and give it back to you without thinking about what all the business risks are and what the other outcomes could be.
Great point.
Yeah.
Mike Hacker, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.